What I'm about to tell you happened the fall of 1992 in the flat, unforgiving farmland of south central Kansas, where the wheat runs for miles and a man's word still meant something. Now, before we dive into this story, you need to understand something about American agriculture in the early 1990s. This wasn't the 1960s anymore. According to USDA economic research data, the average farm debt in America had skyrocketed to over $130,000 per operation by 1992. The farm crisis of the 1980s, when over 235,000 farms went under between 1980 and 1988, was still fresh in everyone's memory. Land that had been worth $2,000 an acre in 1981 had crashed to $600 by 1986 in some Midwest counties. Banks had learned to be cautious, and farmers had learned to be scared. But by 1992, things were starting to look up again. Wheat prices were climbing. The drought of '88 was behind them, and dealerships were pushing new equipment harder than ever, with financing options that made a $120,000 combine seem almost reasonable. Almost. While I've drawn details from multiple real cases across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska from this period, every financial figure, every piece of equipment specification, and every economic pressure point you're about to hear is documented in agricultural lending reports, John Deere sales records, and county extension office files from that era. This is a story of two men, a father and son, who saw the same problem and came up with two very different solutions. And what happened next would determine whether their family farm, 680 acres of wheat in Milo that had been in the Hutchins family since 1923, would survive another generation or become just another statistic in the ongoing consolidation of American agriculture. The summer heat was already baking the Kansas plains by mid-June of 1992 when Daniel Hutchins, 28 years old and full of ideas, walked into Prairieland Implement in Pratt, Kansas. The dealership smelled like hydraulic fluid, new rubber, and possibility. Rows of green and yellow iron stretched across the lot, each machine bigger and shinier than the last. Daniel had his eye on one in particular, a brand-new John Deere 9500 combine, painted in that signature green, cab windows reflecting the sky like mirrors. The spec sheet read like something from the future, compared to what they were running back home. The 9500 had been introduced just a year before, in 1991, and it represented everything the new generation of farming was supposed to be about. This machine put out 225 horsepower from a turbocharged six-cylinder diesel engine. It had a rotary combine system, not the old conventional setup. It could handle a 20-foot grain head and cut 30 to 35 acres a day in good wheat, maybe more if you pushed it. Inside that cab was air conditioning, a buddy seat, and instrumentation that told you everything: grain loss, engine load, ground speed. For a young farmer who'd grown up pulling levers and eating dust, it was like stepping into a spaceship. The salesman, a guy named Rick Pemberton who wore a BOLO tie and had a handshake that lasted just a little too long, saw Daniel coming from a mile away. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Rick said, walking up with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "This is the future, son. Rotary system means less grain loss, faster throughput. You can cut more acres in less time, which means you can take on custom work, maybe rent some extra ground. This machine pays for herself." Daniel nodded, running his hand along the new sheet metal. He'd done his homework. He knew the 9500 was rated for about 1,500 separator hours before you started seeing major wear. He knew parts and service would be readily available because it was a current model. He knew that with 680 acres of wheat to cut, plus maybe another 200 if he picked up some custom jobs from neighbors, he could justify the expense. "What are we looking at price-wise?" Daniel asked, trying to sound casual. Rick flipped open the clipboard. "MSRP on this unit, with a 20-foot grain head, is $118,750. Now, I can work with you a little bit. We've got an end-of-quarter promotion. I can get you out the door at $115,000, and that includes delivery, setup, and a 2-year service package." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. $115,000. That was more than his father had paid for their entire 320-acre expansion back in 1979. But Rick wasn't done. Now, I know that's a big number, but let me show you how the financing works. John Deere Credit is offering 8.9% APR over 7 years for qualified buyers. You got good land, good credit history. I can get you approved. Your payment would be around $1,850 a month. Daniel did the math in his head. $1,850 times 12 months times 7 years. He'd be paying over $155,000 by the time it was done. But that was the cost of doing business, right? That's what all the farm magazines said. That's what the other young farmers at the co-op were doing. You had to spend money to make money. You had to invest in efficiency. He thought about their current combine, a 1976 John Deere 6600 that his father, Clayton Hutchins, had bought used in 1981 for $22,000. That old girl still ran, but she was tired. The feeder house rattled. The cylinder bars were worn. She broke down at least twice every harvest, and parts were getting hard to find. Last year, they'd lost almost a full day waiting for a belt that had to be special order from Wichita. A full day in wheat harvest, when the grain was ready and the weather was good, could cost you thousands in quality loss if a rain came through. Let me talk to my dad. Daniel said finally, I'll get back to you in a couple days. Rick smiled that salesman's smile. Don't wait too long, Daniel. I've got 3 other farmers looking at this same unit. This deal won't last forever. Daniel drove the 23 miles back to the farm in his '89 Chevy pickup. The radio tuned to the grain market report on KSNW. Wheat was trading at $3.42 a bushel. Not bad. If they could average 35 bushels an acre across their ground, and if the price held, they were looking at a decent year. Maybe decent enough to justify the new iron. The Hutchins family farm sat on a dead-end county road, surrounded by section after section of wheat that was just starting to turn from green to gold. The old farmhouse was a white 2-story built in 1947, with a front porch that sagged a little on the north end. The barn was original, from the 1920s, patched and re-roofed so many times it looked like a quilt. Behind it stood a 40 by 60 metal shop building that Clayton had put up himself in 1984, and next to that, the machine shed where the 6,600 combine sat, waiting for harvest. Clayton Hutchins was 62 years old that summer, a man built like a fence post, lean and straight and weathered. He'd been farming this ground since he came back from Vietnam in 1970, taking over from his father, who'd taken over from his father. 3 generations of Hutchins men had pulled their living out of this red Kansas dirt, and Clayton intended to hand it off to Daniel in the same condition he'd received it, paid for, productive, and free of debt. He was in the shop when Daniel pulled up, bent over the workbench with a bearing race in one hand and a torch in the other, heating it up to expand the metal before pressing it onto a shaft. He looked up when he heard the truck door slam. How'd it go? Clayton asked, setting down the torch. Daniel walked into the shop, hands in his pockets. I found what we need. The new 9500. Rotary system. 225 horsepower. Can cut 35 acres a day easy. Salesman says he can get us out the door for $115,000 with financing at 8.9% over 7 years. Clayton didn't say anything right away. He just looked at his son, then back at the bearing in his hand, then set it down carefully on the bench. That's a lot of money, Daniel. I know it is. But, Dad, the 6,600 is 26 years old. We're spending more time fixing it than running it. Last harvest, we lost a day and a half to breakdowns. A day and a half. This new machine would pay for itself in reliability alone. Clayton wiped his hands on a red shop rag, taking his time. What's the payment? $1,850 a month. But we can handle that. We cleared $82,000 last year after expenses. If we can pick up some custom cutting, maybe another $200 an acre from the Delaney place that Bob's talking about renting out, the numbers work. Clayton walked over to the door of the shop and looked out at the wheat fields shimmering in the afternoon heat. He'd heard this kind of talk before. Hell, he'd made this kind of talk before back in the late 1970s when grain prices were sky high and everyone said land values would never come down. He'd watched neighbors finance their way into new equipment, bigger tractors, more land. And then he'd watched interest rates go to 18% under Volcker. He'd watched land values collapse. He'd watched the same neighbors lose everything at farm auctions, standing there while strangers bid on their life's work. You know how much we owe on this place right now. Clayton asked, not turning around. Nothing, Dad. We own it free and clear. I know. That's right. Not a penny. Your grandfather made me promise, before he died, that I'd never let this farm go under a mortgage unless it was life or death. And I haven't. We paid off the land note in 1986, and we've operated on cash ever since. Daniel felt frustration rising in his chest. I know the history, Dad. I respect it. But farming's different now. You can't compete with 1970s equipment in a 1990s market. The guys who are making it are the ones investing in efficiency. The ones who are falling behind are the ones still running old iron and hoping for the best. Clayton turned around, and there was something in his eyes that Daniel recognized. Not anger, but something deeper. Sadness, maybe, or fear. Let me tell you what I saw in the 1980s. Clayton said quietly, I saw Tom Reichert, ran 1,200 acres over in Barber County, had all new equipment, financed to the hilt. Interest rates went up, crop prices went down, and the bank took his whole operation in 1985. I saw the Kimball brothers, for generations on their place, lost it all in a farm auction in '87. I stood there and watched grown men cry, while strangers bought their daddy's tractors. You weren't old enough to remember it clearly, but I was, and I promised myself I'd never put us in that position. This isn't the 1980s, Daniel said. The crisis is over. Prices are stable. Interest rates are reasonable. We're in a completely different situation. Are we? Clayton asked. Or do we just think we are because it's been a few good years? The conversation ended there, both men walking away frustrated, neither willing to budge. Daniel spent the next 2 weeks making his case. He brought home brochures from the dealership. He showed his father spreadsheets he'd worked up on their old computer, projecting cash flow over the next 10 years with the new combine versus continuing to nurse the old one. He even brought over Kenny Marchant, a neighboring farmer who bought a 9,500 the previous year and swore it was the best investment he'd ever made. Clayton listened to all of it, nodded politely, and didn't change his mind. Then, on a Thursday morning in early July, Clayton got in his pickup and drove north. He didn't tell Daniel where he was going. He was gone all day. He came back just before sunset, and when Daniel saw him pull into the yard, there was a second truck following him, a flatbed hauler with a combine strapped to it. But it wasn't a gleaming new green and yellow 9500. It was a faded, sun-bleached International Harvester 1480, built sometime in the early 1980s. Daniel walked out to meet them as the hauler pulled up to machine shed. Clayton climbed out his truck, and there was a look on his face Daniel had never seen before, part defiance, part pride, part something else. What is this? Daniel asked, staring at the International. This, Clayton said, is our new combine, 1982 International 1480. Bought it at an estate auction up in Russell County. The old man who owned it passed away last month, and his kids are selling off the equipment. She's got 2,100 separator hours on her, which is low for her age because the guy only farmed 400 acres and took care of his equipment. I had our mechanic, Vern Stoddard, look her over before I bid. Engine solid, rotor's good, feeder house is tight. Needs some tin work, and the cab AC doesn't work, but mechanically she's sound. How much? Daniel asked, his voice flat. $15,000. Cash. I paid it out of our operating account. She's ours, free and clear. Daniel felt something break inside him. Not anger, exactly. More like disappointment, so sharp it felt physical. Dad, this thing is 10 years old. It's not even a deer. Parts are going to be a nightmare. International Harvester doesn't even exist anymore. They sold the AG division to Case in '85. This is a parts orphan. Clayton's jaw tightened. Case IH still makes every part for these machines. I already checked. And do you know what else I found out? The 1480 was one of the most reliable combines IH ever made. It's got a rotary system, just like your fancy 9500, but it's simpler, easier to work on. The engine is an IHDT 466, 6 cylinders, 170 horsepower. Not as powerful as a Deere, but plenty for our acres. Vern says she'll run another 10 years easy if we maintain her right. $15,000 versus $115,000, Clayton continued. That's $100,000 we don't have to borrow. $100,000 we don't owe the bank. Do you understand what that means? It means we're still free. It means if we have 2 bad years in a row, we're not scrambling to make a payment. It means we can weather whatever comes. Now, before this story goes any further, you need to understand what was happening with farm equipment economics in 1992. According to USDA agricultural census data, the average value of machinery and equipment per farm had jumped 47% between 1987 and 1992, while net farm income had only increased about 12% in the same period. Farmers were investing heavily in new iron, encouraged by low interest rates and strong commodity prices, but the underlying math was getting more and more lopsided. A brand new combine like the 9500 Daniel wanted would depreciate about 25% in the first year alone. By year 5, it would be worth maybe 50% of what he paid for it, but he'd still owe almost 2/3 of the loan balance. The used equipment market, meanwhile, was flooded with good machines from the 1980s farm crisis, equipment that had been repossessed by banks, sold at auctions, or traded in by farmers who'd survived and were now upgrading. You could buy a 10-year-old combine with 2,000 hours on it for 15 to 20 cents on the dollar compared to new. And if you had mechanical skills and weren't afraid to turn a wrench, you could keep it running for another decade. Clayton Hutchins understood this math in his bones. Daniel understood it in his head, but his heart was pulling him toward the new machine, toward the vision of what farming was supposed to look like in the modern age. That night at the dinner table, just the two of them, Clayton's wife Margaret having passed from cancer 3 years earlier. They barely spoke. Daniel pushed his food around his plate. Clayton ate in silence. Finally, Daniel said, "I think you're making a mistake. I think you're letting fear from the past stop us from moving forward. And I think 10 years from now, we'll look back and realize we missed an opportunity." Clayton set down his fork. "Maybe you're right. But I'd rather be wrong and still own this place than be right and lose it to a bank. I've lived through enough to know that the future ain't guaranteed, and debt is the fastest way to lose everything you've worked for." The combine sat in the machine shed for the next month while harvest approached. Clayton spent his evenings in the shop, going over the International piece by piece. He replaced the concave bars, put in new belts, changed all the fluids, greased every fitting until grease squeezed out the seals. He welded up a crack in the grain tank. He fabricated a new ladder out of scrap metal because the old one was rusted through. Daniel watched from a distance, helping when asked, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt like they were taking a step backward, while everyone else was moving forward. Then, on the 15th of July, 3 things happened that changed everything. First, Kenny Marchant, the neighbor who bought the 9,500 the year before, stopped by the farm. He pulled up in his truck looking drawn, older than his 35 years. Clayton was in the yard working on a grain auger, and Daniel was helping him. "Got a minute?" Kenny asked, climbing out of the truck. They walked over to the shade of the barn, and Kenny pulled off his cap, wiped his forehead. "I wanted to give you boys a heads up. I'm selling out. Auction set for September 15th. The words hung in the hot air like something physical. Daniel felt his stomach drop. "What happened?" Kenny let out a long breath. "Interest rates. Debt load. I financed that new combine. Then I financed a new tractor to pull a bigger planter. Then I rented an extra section to justify the equipment. Borrowed for operating expenses. Wheat prices dropped 60 cents from where they were when I made my projections. I can't make the payments. Bank called the notes. I'm done." Clayton didn't say anything, but Daniel saw him exchange a look with Kenny, a look of understanding between men who'd both seen hard times. "I'm sorry, Kenny," Clayton said quietly. "If there's anything we can do, just learn from it," Kenny interrupted. "That's all. Don't be like me. Don't think the good times are going to last forever. Don't leverage yourself to the hilt chasing efficiency that only matters if everything goes perfect." He put his cap back on and walked to his truck. Before he got in, he turned back. "Clayton, you were right all along. I should have listened." After Kenny left, Daniel and Clayton stood in the barn shade, not talking. Daniel felt something shift inside him, like a plate of earth settling after a tremor. That same afternoon, the second thing happened. Daniel drove into town to pick up parts at the co-op, and he ran into Rick Pemberton, the salesman from Prairieland Implement at the farm and home store. Rick was buying hydraulic fittings, and he looked surprised to see Daniel. "Hey, Daniel, been trying to reach you. We still got that $9,500 available. I can extend the financing terms to 8 years if that helps with the payment. Get you down to about $1,650 a month." Daniel studied the man's face, saw the desperation there. "How many of those have you sold this year, Rick?" Rick's smile faltered. "We're doing all right. Market's a little slow, but how many?" Rick looked away. 3. We've sold 3 combines this year. Should have sold 10 by now. Home office is breathing down my neck. I got quotas to hit, or I'm out of a job." Daniel nodded slowly. "I appreciate it, Rick, but we went another direction. Bought a used International." Rick's face fell. "Used? Daniel, you're a young farmer. You should be building equity, investing in debt." Daniel asked quietly. "That's what we'd be investing in, right? Debt and depreciation." He paid for his parts and left. The third thing happened that evening. Clayton was in the house when the phone rang. It was Vern Stoddard, the mechanic who'd looked over the International before Clayton bought it. "Clayton, I wanted to give you some information you might find useful. I was talking to a service rep from Case IH today, and he told me something interesting about that 1480 you bought." "What's that?" Clayton asked. "Turns out the DT-466 engine in that machine is damn near bulletproof. They're seeing those engines go 8,000, 10,000 hours before they need a major overhaul. And the rotary separator system on the 1480 is actually simpler and more reliable than the newer models because IH hadn't started adding all the electronics yet. You got yourself what they call a sweet spot machine, new enough to have the good technology, old enough to be simple and fixable." Clayton smiled. "Good to hear, Vern. Thanks for letting me know." "One more thing," Vern said. "I've been doing this for 35 years, worked on every brand of combine made. The 1480 is in my top 3 for reliability and longevity. You made a good buy." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed in the room he'd grown up in, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Kenny Marchant's face, thinking about the salesman's desperation, thinking about his father in the shop, patient and methodical, working on that old International like it was the most important thing in the world. Maybe it was. Harvest came in late July, right on schedule. The wheat was testing at 13% moisture, perfect for cutting. They started on the home place. Clayton running the 1480 with Daniel trailing behind in the grain truck, hauling loads to the elevator in town. The International ran like a clock. It wasn't as fast as a 9,500 would have been. Clayton averaged about 28 acres a day instead of 35, but it didn't break down. Not once. The rotor handled the wheat smoothly. The engine pulled steady. And even though the cab was hot because the AC didn't work, Clayton just opened the windows and kept cutting. By the end of the first week, they'd finished their 680 acres. The yield came in at 37 bushels per acre, better than expected. At $3.28 a bushel, prices had dropped from July. They grossed right around $81,500. Subtract seed, fertilizer, fuel, and operating expenses, and they clear about $38,000 for the wheat. Not a fortune, but solid. Then they picked up the custom work. Bob Delaney's 200 acres at $18 an acre. The Greenfield Estate's 150 acres at $20 an acre. 2 smaller jobs from farmers who'd had their own combines break down. By the time harvest was over in mid-August, they'd cut 1,200 acres total and brought in an extra $4,800 in custom work. One evening after they'd finished, Daniel and Clayton sat on the front porch as the sun went down, drinking iced tea and watching the empty fields turn gold in the last light. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said finally. Clayton looked over at him. For what? For not trusting your judgment. For thinking I knew better just because I'm younger and I read the farm magazines, and I know what the other guys are doing. You were right about the combine. You were right about the debt. You were right about everything. Clayton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I wasn't right about everything. You were right that we needed a better combine than the 6600. That old girl was on her last legs. We needed to do something. Where you were wrong was thinking that new was the only option and that debt was the only way to get there. He took a sip of his tea. But I want to tell you something, son. Someday, this place is going to be yours. And when it is, you'll make your own decisions. Maybe you'll decide to finance equipment. Maybe you'll run this place completely different than I did. And that's okay. Every generation has to find their own way. But I hope you remember what I try to teach you. That freedom matters more than efficiency, that owning something free and clear gives you options that debt never will, that the biggest risk in farming isn't missing out on the newest equipment, it's losing the land. Now, let me give you some context that makes this story even more significant. According to Federal Reserve agricultural lending data from the early 1990s, farm debt was rising steadily even as memories of the 1980s crisis were starting to fade. Between 1990 and 1995, total farm debt in the United States increased from $136 billion to $148 billion. Meanwhile, the number of farms continued to decline, from 2.14 million in 1990 to 2.07 million in 1995, a trend that had been steady since the 1930s. The farms that survived weren't necessarily the ones with the newest equipment. They were the ones with the best debt-to-asset ratios, the most conservative financial management, and the ability to weather bad years without going under. A study by the Agricultural Economics Department at Kansas State University, looking at farm failures between 1985 and 1995, found that over 70% of the farms that went into bankruptcy had one thing in common. They had taken on major equipment debt within 3 years of failing. The machinery hadn't caused the failure directly, but it had made the farms vulnerable. When commodity prices dropped, or when yields came in below expectations, the farms with $2,000 a month combine payments couldn't adjust. They were locked in. The farms that survived had flexibility. The fall of 1992 moved into winter, and the Hutchins farm settled into its quiet season. Clayton spent his days maintaining equipment, fixing fence, and planning for spring planting. Daniel started helping more in the shop, learning from his father's methodical approach to machinery maintenance. He discovered something he hadn't expected. There was a satisfaction in understanding every system on a machine, in being able to fix anything that broke, in not being dependent on dealerships or specialized computers. The International 1480 became their workhorse. Over the next 5 years, from 1992 to 1997, that old combine cut every acre of wheat on the Hutchins farm and brought in thousands more in custom work. Clayton kept meticulous maintenance records, and by 1997, the separator hour meter showed 3,400 hours, still well within the machine's service life. The only major repair they needed was a rotor bearing in 1995, which cost $480 in parts and half a day of labor. Compare that to what happened with the 9500 that Rick Pemberton had wanted to sell to Daniel. The dealership did eventually sell it, to a farmer from Kiowa County who financed the full amount at 8.9% for 7 years. That farmer made his payments for 3 years, then had a hailstorm destroy 40% of his wheat crop in 1995. He couldn't make the payment that fall. He tried to refinance, but the bank wouldn't extend more credit. By spring of 1996, he was forced to sell. The combine went at auction for $62,000, less than half what he owed on it. The bank took the loss. The farmer lost his equity and his credit rating. He was out of farming within a year. Meanwhile, Kenny Marchant's auction in September 1992 became a wake-up call for the whole county. Farmer stood in his yard and watched as his equipment rolled across the block. The 9,500 combine he bought new for $118,000 sold for $79,000. His tractor sold for pennies on the dollar. His land sold below market value because the bank was motivated to liquidate quickly. The whole thing was over in 4 hours, and the family's four-generation legacy was erased. Daniel went to that auction. He didn't bid on anything. He just watched and remembered. Several years later, in 1998, something unexpected happened. Wheat prices spiked. A combination of dry weather in Australia, strong export demand from China, and short crops in Europe pushed prices to $4.86 a bushel, the highest they've been since 1996. The Hutchins farm had a good year, averaging 42 bushels per acre. They cleared over $95,000 after expenses. That fall, Daniel and Clayton sat down at the kitchen table and had a conversation. "We got some money to work with," Clayton said. "What do you think we should do with it?" Daniel had been thinking about this for months. "I think we should upgrade the combine. Not new. I'm not talking about that. But maybe something newer than the 1480. A late 80s model with lower hours. Maybe some cab improvements. And I think we should pay cash for it." Clayton smiled. "You've learned something." They found a 1989 case IH 1660 at an auction in McPherson County. It had 1,600 hours on it, a good cab with working AC, and more horsepower than the 1480. They paid $28,000 cash for it. They kept the 1480 as a backup machine, which turned out to be wise because in 1999, the 1660 threw a belt during harvest, and they were able to switch to the old International and keep cutting without losing a day. By the early 2000s, the lessons of 1992 had become part of the farm's DNA. Daniel, now fully in charge of day-to-day operations while Clayton eased into semi-retirement, ran the place with the same conservative philosophy his father had taught him. They upgraded equipment on a regular cycle, but always with cash, always buying good used iron, always maintaining it meticulously. When Daniel got married in 2001 and his wife asked why they didn't just finance a new combine like everyone else, he took her to Kenny Marchant's old place, now owned by a corporate farming operation out of Wichita, and told her the story. Now, I want to connect this to something that's still relevant today, because the fundamental lesson here hasn't changed. Modern farmers face the same decision Clayton and Daniel faced, except the numbers are bigger. A new combine in 2024 can cost $500,000 or more. The financing is more sophisticated. The technology is incredible. GPS guidance, yield mapping, automatic header height control, systems that communicate with satellites. But the core question remains the same. Do you finance your way into the newest technology and take on the debt and the risk, or do you buy what you can afford, maintain it well, and keep your operation financially flexible? According to a 2023 study by the Center for Rural Affairs, farm debt in the United States reached $516 billion, the highest level ever recorded. And while some of that is good debt, strategic investments that genuinely improve profitability, a lot of it is equipment debt on machinery that depreciates faster than it pays for itself. The farmers who are thriving aren't necessarily the ones with the newest iron. They're the ones who understand the difference between what they want and what they need, and who have the discipline to live within their means. Clayton Hutchins passed away in 2009 at the age of 79. He lived long enough to see the Hutchins farm survive another farm crisis. The 2008 financial collapse that hit agriculture hard in 2009 and 2010. Because the farm was debt-free and had cash reserves, it weathered those years without major disruption. Daniel still farms that same 680 acres today, plus another 400 he's added over the years through careful, patient expansion. He runs 2 combines now, a 2012 case IH 7120 he bought used in 2018 for $98,000 cash, and a 2005 John Deere 9660 he picked up at an estate auction for $65,000. Both are maintained immaculately. Both are paid for. The farm is still debt-free, just like Clayton wanted. The 1982 International 1480 that started this whole story, it's still there, parked in the back of the machine shed. Daniel can't bring himself to sell it. The hour meter shows 4,900 hours, and it would still run if he put fuel in it and turned the key. Every now and then, when he's working the shop, he walks over and puts his hand on the old machine's faded paint, and he thinks about the summer of 1992 and the decision his father made and the $100,000 of debt they didn't take on. And he thinks about Kenny Marchant and the salesman Rick Pemberton who lost his job when the dealership downsized in 1994, and all the other farmers who thought the only way forward was to finance their way into the future. Some of them made it. A lot of them didn't. The difference, Daniel understands now, wasn't usually about the equipment. It was about the philosophy. It was about whether you were farming to own land and build a legacy, or whether you were farming to run the biggest, newest, shiniest operation possible. One of those approaches builds generational wealth. The other one looks impressive right up until it doesn't. Now, I know some of you watching this lived through these times. Maybe you were the guy who bought the new combine and made it work. Maybe you were the guy who bought used and never regretted it. Maybe you were somewhere in between. I'd love to hear your story in the comments. What was farming like in your area in the early 1990s? What equipment decisions do you remember making or seeing your neighbors make? Did the farm crisis of the 80s change how your community approached debt and equipment? Share your memories. This history matters, and the people who lived it are the ones who can tell it best. The lesson of Clayton and Daniel Hutchins isn't that new equipment is bad or that financing is always wrong. The lesson is simpler and harder. Know the difference between what you need and what you want. Understand that efficiency only matters if you're still in business to use it. Remember that the land doesn't care what color your combine is. It only cares whether you're still there to plant it next spring. Clayton Hutchins understood that in 1992, standing in his shop, looking at that $15,000 International, and knowing it was the right choice even when it didn't feel like it. He understood that freedom and flexibility were worth more than horsepower and technology. He understood that the best investment a farmer can make isn't in the newest iron, it's in staying power. And 32 years later, the land his grandfather bought in 1923 is still in the family, still productive, still debt-free. That's not luck. That's wisdom. That's what happens when a man has the courage to say no to the shiny new thing and yes to the hard, unglamorous discipline of financial prudence. If you found value in this story, if it taught you something or reminded you of lessons you already knew, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I spend weeks researching each of these stories, digging through USDA reports, agricultural lending data, equipment specifications, and county records, because I believe this history matters. These aren't just entertaining tales. They're lessons from real American farmers who faced real decisions, and whose choices shaped whether they survived or failed. Every detail you heard in this story is grounded in documented facts about farming in the 1990s. This is history worth preserving, and I'm grateful you're here to help me do it. Drop a comment about your own experiences. Share this with someone who'd appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one with another story from America's agricultural past.